I'm Mariana Marcucci. I'm a member of the Europeana Management Board, the Europeana Network Association Management Board. And today I'm a member of the steering group of the Communicators Community. The Communicators Community is the organizer of today's webinar, today's event. Thanks to a lady, will give the floor later, Claudia Porto from Brazil. And as many times the ideas pop up, usually this time during a conversation about our interest and the way we wish the cultural heritage and the communications will go. We thought that Europe and Brazil would have been our next challenge, let's say, speaking about museums and the way museums are leading with all the pieces that came, let's say, from a colonization period. We are preparing something bigger for next year, so today is our, let's say, first step of a more and wider conversation about decolonization in museums. At the end of the webinar, keep in touch with the communicators community and with us, because we are organizing more events like today's. I don't want to bore you with my chat and my word, because I want to steal time to the webinar to our wonderful and amazing speakers of today. So I will leave the floor to our amazing Claudia Porto, the organizing and the head of today's event. Claudia, thank you for organizing this from my side, and the floor is yours.
Very well then. Now that we are all on the right channels, and before we start, I just wanted to give you some housekeeping announcements here. The first one is that we have simultaneous interpretation, and you can access the channels through the little globe icon. Once you click on it, you will have the chance to select the channel of your preference, and you can also mute the original audio in order to enhance your experience. And if you are on your mobile instead of your computer, you have a circle with 3 dots, and then you click on it and you go for interpretation and you click on done. Once you select the channel, you have to click on done. So without any further delay, good morning to all the Brazilian friends here and all the colleagues from the Americas, and good afternoon and good evening to the guests from other countries who are here with us this morning or afternoon or evening. My name is Claudia Porto. I'm a museologist and I'm a consultant on collection management, and with a focus on the incredible transforming power that museums have on society. I was elected to the board members at Europeana Network Association, and as part of this network, I'm also a member of the communicators group, as Mariana told us in the beginning, and I'm also part of the ICOM advisory board. And it's a huge pleasure to welcome you all here in this meeting in this first webinar, which is Decolonizing Museum Practices, a dialogue between Brazil and Europe, which was organized by the communicators group from Europeana. And we have been witnessing a very breakthrough in decolonization practices, both in research as well as in institutional practices, policies, and methodologies. And again, we have been witnessing the coming up of new initiatives that were actually built in a participatory fashion with the groups and communities, as the processes should be. However, we all know that this is just the beginning and we have a long way ahead in order for us to effectively have the changes that we wish for. But we definitely hope that this conversation will help us to exchange challenges, to understand the different stages of implementation of colonial approaches, digital approaches, and many other initiatives. So our intention is that this is the very, very first of this many series of webinars that that we intend to carry out, among many other actions that the Europeana Network will carry out with the institutions, with the Brazilian museum institutions. And just before we give the floor to our speaker and mediator, Isabel Beirigo, let me introduce you to our panel members. So we have here with us Sandra Benitez. She's a master's in social anthropology by the postgraduate program at the National Museum of Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And she's the arts curator, educator, and activist of the Guarani and Andeva peoples. And she is the visual arts director of FUNART, the National Foundation of Arts. And she was also the curator of the Brazilian art in the Assis Chateaubriand Museum of Arts from São Paulo, MASP. And Professor Marilia Xavier Cury, she's a museologist and a museum educator, and she works in the Ethnology and Archaeology Museum from the University of São Paulo, USB. Since 1992, she's been in this position. And since 2010, she has been dedicated to collaborative research in indigenous peoples in the center-western region of the country, and particularly in relation with the museums and the musealization processes. Georgia Manopolo is a PhD student in cultural diplomacy, and she works in Hellenic Ministry of Culture and Sports as a museologist and the curator of public and educational programs in the Patex Archaeological Museum. She is a Fulbright scholar and also the Fellow of Cultural Innovators and a Fellow of Neon Association. And she's also the author of many international papers in cultural management field, and she has been participating as a scientific member in many European projects. And Isabel Beirigo, she's an expert in research communication and heritage, Dutch department. And in the Debates project, Isabel has contributed for the development of work methodologies with communities and co-creation sections. And that project has created an AI-based tool in order to detect and identify and contextualize historically the problematic, sensitive languages that is present on the metadata of heritage protected collections. And so thank you very much for your audience, and I wish you a great debate. And Isabel, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Claudia.
Hi, everyone, and good afternoon. For me, it is a big pleasure to be here with you all today. And I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation. This is only the first step, as Mariana and Claudia said before, to a long and fruitful collaboration, I hope. And I will now switch to Portuguese. That is my mother language, but I'm very happy to take any questions that you have in English. And you can ask your questions in the chat because at the end of the conversation, we're going to address some of these questions.
So good morning, good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Once again, thank you very much for attending the session today. And I believe that this is a very important moment to all of us, and it's really a key moment for us to deepen this conversation between Brazil and Europe with regards to this process of rethinking our museum practices and how institutions and organizations, cultural heritage can change its practices from colonialized practices towards a more diverse and that will appreciate the beauty of the peoples all over the world. In order to start this conversation, I'd like to invite Sandra Benitez, who is going to tell us a little bit more about the work that you have been developing at FUNART, and as well how is it that you regard this relation between the indigenous peoples and the institutional practices, and in particular, as we all know, in particular with regards to the fact that the institutional practices can be somewhat limiting and represent some constraints. So please tell us who you are and what you do and your experience.
Thank you for the invitation, for having me, and I haven't prepared anything. I'm going to be brief, and I can share certain things that I have been writing, but everything is in Portuguese. Well, as I said, I am a PhD. I have completed my doctorate in social anthropology at the National Museum at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And currently, I am an museum art director. I am indigenous of the Guarani people in Brazil. I talk about Brazil because we have other Guarani peoples in other countries like Bolivia, Paraguay, and Argentina. And so I would just like to speak briefly about the political issues. The system here develops and organizes itself from the time I bring my perception as an indigenous woman, my perception as the Guarani people, but I also bring not specifically of the Guarani people, but overall, indigenous overall, how we think, for example, what heritage is, what also what art is, and what aesthetics is, because art involves aesthetics, and how it, from aesthetics, we need to discuss, for example, how they deal with these elements of the earth, as I call them. And that is why also for us to debate on collections, art, and on heritage, I think it is important for us to understand the logic or the rationale of the indigenous peoples overall as to how they think on their relationship with the world. And we can understand that from the cosmology of every people. But all the indigenous peoples have a relationship of affection to the earth as part of it, as part of their body, as part of their existence. This is why it is so important to bring such provocations as to how every people think about their territories, their land, to their people, how you design things. It is a way of architecture or designing. It's not the architecture of an object, of molding or forging an object. It's the way we're learning the world, how we deal with the plants, with the rivers, with the birds, with all those elements of the land. It's not by chance that we understand that the land is like the uterus. That is why we call it Mother Earth. Thank you very much, Sandra. You can continue. I am bringing this provocation, and I would need to hear more if somebody wants to ask, and then from that I can give you some answers from your provocations. Perfect. Thank you very much for your introduction. I think you start bringing some questions here that are very interesting for us to think. For example, this way of looking at the relationship between the body and the earth as a a single thing. There is no division. There is no separation that we usually in academia and in museums, we usually see that. Thank you very much for bringing these first points for us to think about. As Sandra mentioned, and directing to everyone, as Sandra said, if you have any questions, please write them on the chat, because at the end we're going to have some room for questions. I'm now going to invite Marília Xavier to talk about her work. Marília, I'd like you to talk a bit about the work that you've been carrying out, if I'm not mistaken, since 2010 in São Paulo with several indigenous people. And what have you learned and continue learning in this relationship between the museum, the indigenous people, and when this kind of work happens in a collaborative way? Tell us a bit about your experience. Good morning, everyone. My greetings to Dr. Sandra Benítez, who is the indigenous person that represents us as Indigenous Brazil at this event. My work is always collaborative, has always been collaborative since 2010. I don't work in any other way other than with indigenous groups, with Kaingani, Guarani, Deva, and Terena of the indigenous land, Araribá, Ipatu, Imanuiri, in the Midwest of the São Paulo state, as it's been mentioned, which is actually an indigenous territory since 2010 to the present moment, precisely today, before joining this webinar, I was addressing issues and work issues and things with my indigenous colleagues. It's not a work that is never completed. We're always open up new actions, new things, and always understanding that it is very important for us to locate where our meeting is, precisely in the relationship between the indigenous people and museums, that in American Brazil, perhaps in many other places in the world, is a relationship that is very well historically determined by conflicts and many times by violence in the acquisition of such collections that are in museums. So we try to understand this relationship and change this relationship from a succession of projects, joint projects, that will be very objective and practical, with a lot of debate and with great objectivity and practice, especially on what brings visibility to the indigenous peoples through museums. It is also important to say that this work is based on dialogue, but especially dialogue seeking a transformation. And the main points, I would say, or values, are respect and a relationship of trust. Those projects take place from where I work, which is the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology of the University of São Paulo. Sometimes we have the initiatives taking place in the museum with all these three groups taking part in the work processes, and they come to the museum. So they move from their territories to our museum, MAI, and the opposite also happens. But only going to indigenous land can we actually get to know their realities and also better understand their political agendas and claims. To sum up, now, I would say three action axes. There are many projects carried out repeatedly, and I can highlight and gather them in three axes. First axis is the curating of exhibitions in museums, also collaborating with indigenous museums in those territories, curating collections those collections are formed in those territories. I've mentioned Araribá, Manuíri, and Catu in the Midwest of São Paulo state, and increasingly more, we're acting with publications in which the indigenous and their groups and indigenous authorities come in as authors, since they don't want museums to speak for themselves. So we open up those museological structures so that they can speak for themselves, be it through exhibitions or leaving their statements or their records in collections to the present, and also through publications. I don't know if we can share the images. There are 3 images. They're just for illustration, actually. Can somebody share Marilia's images? I think she had some photos.
Tamara, could you? Yes, thank you.
That's it. Well, this illustrates the work of requalifying collection. This is a young Guarani Andegot of the village of Araribá. The requalification of an archaeological item, and it is a time when he was presenting an archaeological item. He shows his body, his identity with the same graphism in this ceramics or earthenware of many centuries ago. That is the same as he has on his arm. The next one, please. So this photo to me is the most powerful one, since the question is what we have learned with the indigenous people. This is a very strong synthesis, but very complete, of a learning that we have had at our museum, I personally, which is understanding the museum as a sacred place and the exhibition as a sacred place. Just as my indigenous partners, they take off their shoes to go into a sacred hut or into the forest. They do the same thing before coming into our warehouse and our museum exhibition. This is a very symbolic summary. It's difficult for me to talk about it, of how much I have learned, not only with dialogue and exchange and understanding increasingly more this indigenous reality, their philosophies, but especially how we can learn from a simple gesture that is not as simple as it may seem. This is it. That's all I wanted to present. We have another image because I think it's most important to have the debate. Thank you, Marilia. I'd just like to stress actually 2 points that I think are very important in your brief introduction. One, which is the aspect of respect. I think the last image illustrates it very well. How, the relationship we have with regarding respect and respecting others and beliefs and respecting differences, and how much we can learn in this process of dialogue, of collaboration with other communities or indigenous people, or people that are outside the museum or outside the cultural center. This is a two-way road or process. We learn, we teach, and we change, and we also bring changes. And the other point that I felt was very relevant in your speech, we can discuss this further on, which is this point that the museum also goes to the place, in your case, it goes towards the indigenous peoples. It's not only bringing people in, communities, indigenous people into the museum, but the museum also follows this direction of going towards them.
Again, and very briefly switch back to English, because the next person I wanted to invite to this conversation is Georgia. So Georgia, just keeping this brief introduction from the perspective of your work at Europeana and at the Ministry of Culture and Archaeological Museum of Patras, what kind of experiences related to decolonization practices have you faced in your work?
Hello, Isabel. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation. It was really an honor to be among all of you and share our museum passion, our passion for cultural heritage, but mostly our main passion is human being, and this is what it's all about. I was from the introductions from Marilia and Sandra, pointed out the architectural triangle. I call it like the DNA mission of our museums, of our cultural heritage institutions, to transform, to build the so-called citizen of the world, to build trust, to build respect. It was really nice, the example that Marilia showed us with inside the door and with this graphismo, and how these elements of our common cultural heritage can be a different process through narratives, through collaborative curatorial programs and projects. And I'm thrilled to share all of this with you and have this powerful introduction for our participants. So, building the so-called citizen of the world. We have, as we say, culture in Europeana is our common ground, is how also Sandra mentioned, is the elements, is the outer that we build this DNA with elements that have this inclusive, but not only inclusive, transformative soft power, as we call it in cultural diplomacy. So representing here as an MC member of Europeana and member of the steering committee of FENA of education. And we have this collaboration with communicators, as Mariana mentioned before, and Claudia. We, in our, first I will start with our work in Europeana, that we share more than 55 million digitized objects to share this philosophy of our common ground, and we provide resources, we provide projects and material and exhibitions, digitized exhibitions, that we shared this philosophy for all educators, not only in Europe, but outside, like this collaboration now we have with you, with Brazil. And through my work as a practitioner and in my museum, which is also an archaeological one from Greece, under the authority of Ministry of Culture, I have curated collaboratory projects through different narratives, through different story tales and different educational engagement, not only because we're not only for students, for all kind of audience, and we adjust and engage our audience in different ways related to the objects, the archaeological objects, or with modern art as well. I will later on, I will give you specific examples, because we have also a really powerful case study with the repatriation of 3 objects from a university museum, from College Museum from Atlanta, to to the Minister of Culture in Greece, and we hosted the exhibition Stolen Past, Lost Future. And through this initiative, this international curatorial project, we had the opportunity to start a bigger project, let's say, a bigger educational network about museums as agents of change, museums as agents of cultural diplomacy, not typical, non-formal, but the power that transforms, shapes the global identity with respect, with and building trust and cohesion, as we will see in our next follow their conversation today. So I'm delighted to hear your questions, to put the framework of this discussion with all our participants, and build a new model, maybe, of an agile, as we say, like a more flexible way to communicate with indigenous people, with other people, other nations, other countries, and point out our common ground as human beings, as the well-being, because my first background is from the School of Athens, philosophy. Aristoteles has mentioned that polis, politismos, is the Greek word for culture. Polis is the city, and the center, human. Human, which we call it in our Greek language, o anthropos. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Georgia. And I think this is actually a very interesting point to think about the how important the museum or the cultural heritage organization, how important they are in forming or opening this space for citizens to work and to collaborate and to have this, to find or rediscover this common ground, right? Because I think we sometimes see in such different ways, or we have different point of views, and instead of trying to find the common space, what we share, we are just repeatedly saying, "Oh, I don't agree," or "This doesn't work." So we're gonna come back to these questions. I'm really curious about.
And it was, yes, Isabel, and this of you, and Marilia and Sandra and you and Claudia, the holistic approach, that we have to share, centered in our central philosophy, which is human, which is polis, as a holistic, a bigger approach of all museum professionals, of all cultural professions, I will say.
Yeah, sure. And we will come back to the discussion, because I'm also very curious about the concept of cultural diplomacy. And I think you're gonna say a little bit more when you say about this specific work. Voltando ao português, muito obrigada a todas vocês.
Great. Back to Portuguese. Thank you once again very, very much to all of you for sharing your experiences. And it's indeed marvelous to listen to those different experiences. And it's amazing how, at the end of the day, it all boils down to the attempt to promote some change. And as I, listened to what you said and what you shared, that also made me think of those discussions that I'm part as member of the ICOM, the Decolonisation group from ICOM. And we have been working together in the last 3 years, discussing, trying to find commonalities and what can be done in terms of the decolonisation And one of the main points that is recurrent here is the fact that the decolonization means different things in different places, right? So it's totally related to the context in which we address decolonization. And that basically means that we do not have a single discussion that is capable of just, embracing all the different experiences and specificities of that specific context. And just giving a couple of steps back in that project that Claudia mentioned in the beginning of her talk, which is the bias, we reached the same type of conclusion, that we do not have a cookbook recipe. We do not have a single format, which is good for everybody. The one size fits all. But we rather need to adapt ourselves, right? And one of the things that we really discussed in depth was up to what extent the group with which you are in contact, the group with which you are conversing and working with, has the specificities and is aware of the specificities that are important for that work to happen. So the Bias project involved the development of a digital tool, which is an AI digital tool. And as Claudia said herself, this tool identifies some derogatory words and attributes a historical context to those words. However, we have worked on this process of creating the whole vocabularium, the whole syllabus, to be part of this tool with many different communities. So from Suriname descendants, from in the Netherlands, Congolese in Belgium, and members from the LGBTQ plus both in Italy and in the UK, and some other representatives from the Jewish community in Germany. And what we realized throughout this whole process is that working in a participatory manner and in a collaborative manner and trying to find this, common ground between museums and cultural institutions and the community needs takes time. It's something that is not going to happen at the blink of an eye. It's time consuming because you need to build trust, because you need to build the dialogue, you need to make room for the dialogue to happen and to listen above all to what people have to say. And at the same time, within the institutions, you have to work and pave the way in such a way that the result of this collaborative work can be embraced and integrated and embedded into the institution. So, and at this point, I think it is important for us to again give the floor to Marilia, because I would like to hear from you, Marilia, a little bit of your experience on how the Indigenous peoples members have been regarding this work in collaboration with the museums. So what are the feedbacks that you have received? How do these people see the work of the museums vis-a-vis to, this recognition, and what is their point of view? If you could please, just tell us a little bit more about the work that you've been doing. Well, you see, Isabel, of course, I'm going to report to you what I've experienced and what I've learned. I think this is very important for me to say right from the outset to give you this answer. So I'm not a representative. I'm not their proxies, right? I am obviously just giving you my perspective as a member of this work and the Endeva, Caetani, and Guarani from the Dararibá and Catu Indigenous series. So they are the ones who are the interlocutors of this institutional work, but they are the active, subjects of this process. And the one thing that I have learned is that each participant of this work, of course, I mean, this involves many different people in different situations and contexts, and they are authorities within this process, They are considered the main voice, within this project and within the museum. So when we sit over a table, either at the mais or at their village, I mean, it's a dialogue between authorities. I'm an authority. We have archaeologists. We have the institutional directors who are authorities. The museologists are authorities. The chieftains, the indigenous professors, and the wise men, and they are all there taking part as people with propriety to speak from their people. And based on the work that I've been developing, of course, I am within a specific institution, a university, museology. I'm a public servant within a public institution, which is also, non-profit, and the objective, the main objective here is to serve society. And in our case, in particular, those three indigenous groups, of course, we have colleagues who are working close to other groups in other projects. So I'm just reporting you from our perspective, from what I have been doing. So it's really important that we realize that this structure is here to serve society. So we run exhibitions together, we do reskilling or upskilling of collections together, and we organize shared catalogs. So in other words, the information, the narratives that are brought, they are not illustrations, they are considered knowledge, they are narrative, which are curatorial. In other words, they are contributions for our documental system. And so, and this goes far beyond only, that notes online records that, so it's knowledge, that is in whole, not as, characters, but rather in whole. And last but not least, we have the communication. So we also organize editions through the MAI.
Mas, ao mesmo tempo, também autoria indígena.
With the authorship that is indigenous also, everyone organized. So as to the return, this collaborative process, very frankly so, I feel that I feel I don't owe anything, like, something to return, because the process is so well integrated. It's so day to day, so constant, that everybody knows what is going on and what happened at some point, because we stop, because sometimes for a reason that is financial, because time, we're few people. So I think it is very important to have this, to be close to everyone, and especially to know why do I know there is an impact there, because they want to continue. To me, the main indicator, they call upon me, they want it, they propose, they provoke me, positively speaking. To me, this is it, the process. It is not this work that has a beginning, middle, and ending. It has the beginning, the middle, and we go back to the beginning and we continue working. So we have this indicator. So they call me, they want it, they propose, because I am not. I always do this. I always call them, I always provoke them. I propose things, because especially that they do this with all the freedom, because, my is theirs as well. So this is it. Thank you, Marilia. I think this point, well, this collaborative work, as you put it quite well, should not be a project in which you have, beginning, middle, and ending, but this continuous process of beginning, developing. Of course, you're going to have some results, but from those outcomes, you have a new beginning. That actually it is very important to be able to create and strengthen the relationship between cultural institutions and the external groups with whom we are working. I'd like to ask Sandra now.
Trazendo o seu ponto de
Sandra,
vista,
bringing
como, né,
your
pessoa que
viewpoint
parte
as a
povo
person
Guarani,
that is
e
part
ao
of
mesmo
the Guarani
tempo,
people,
né,
and at the
tá aí
same time,
contexto, né,
you're
da
in this
academia, né,
context of
que você agora é
academia,
doutora.
and now
Como
you
que
are
para
a
você
PhD.
como
What
que
is it
você vê,
like to
né,
you, and
essa
how do you
relação
see
entre o
this
trabalho
relationship
colaborativo
between
dos
the
povos indígenas com
collaborative
os
work
museus, né,
of
com outras
indigenous
instituições
peoples with
culturais,
museums
em
or
termos, em
other cultural
relação
institutions
às tradições e às
regarding
culturas
traditions
e, ao
and
mesmo
cultures,
tempo,
and
né,
at the
as
same
demandas, mas
time,
também
the
limitações
demands,
dos
but
museus?
also
Vocês poderiam falar um pouquinho
limitations
aí
of
também, por
museums.
favor?
Could you talk to us a bit about
Tá.
this,
Bem,
please? Well,
também eu faço
I
já
also,
eu vou falar mais a partir da minha curadoria, que
I'm going to talk
eu
about
tenho mais relação com o
from the
museu,
viewpoint
né?
of my curating
E,
practice and my relationship with
na
the
qual eu
museum,
faço projeto,
in
né?
which I carry
Primeiro
out
ponto, é um
projects.
desafio
The
muito
first
grande por eu
point,
ser
which is a
indígena,
great
isso não
challenge,
significa que
because
não
I am
haverá
an indigenous
conflito
person, it
entre,
doesn't mean that there won't be
inclusive
conflict
entre museu e eu,
between
né? Eu fico como
museum and
mediadora.
myself.
Eu não
I
sou
act
apenas
as
uma
a
curadora, eu sou uma
mediator.
mediadora,
I'm
mas
not
também
just a
eu também sou uma
curator, I'm
tradutora.
a
É uma
mediator,
tradução
but
que
I'm
faz
also
com
a
que a visão do
translator. It's a
mundo que eu tenho que
translation
tentar
because
fazer
it's the
traduzir
vision of the world that I
para
have to try to
para a instituição.
translate
E essa instituição, muitas das vezes,
for the
vem com
institution. And this
traduzir
institution, many
da
times,
maneira
even trying to
que a
translate in the
comunidade
way
gostaria de trazer,
that
por
the
exemplo,
community would like to bring it.
existe
For
também negociação.
example,
E muitas das vezes
there is
essa negociação
also
ela é bem complexa
negotiation.
e
And
ela também
this
depende
negotiation, it
muito do
can be very
contexto,
complex,
como
and
a
it
Cláudia
depends a lot on the
a Marília, né,
context
já tinha
that
mencionado.
Marilia has already
Existe muito
mentioned.
também essa
We have
questão
a
do
lot of this
contexto,
thing of the
porque tem algumas
context,
comunidades que
because
têm
there are
uma
some
relação mais
communities that
afetiva com a sua
have a more
comunidade,
effective
não tem
relationship with
conflito,
their
né? E nós
communities.
sabemos que
Well,
no Brasil hoje,
there's
né,
no
muitos
conflict. We know
indígenas
that in Brazil today,
são
many
identificados como
indigenous are
invasores, né?
identified
E a
as
gente tem esse
trespassers,
conflito com o
invaders.
território, né?
And so we have this
E
conflict
aí,
with the
nesse
territory.
sentido,
And in this
uma
sense,
negociação muito difícil,
it
porque
is
muitas
very
das vezes
difficult
a gente quer
negotiation
trazer
because many
algo
times we
que é
want to bring
realidade,
something
uma
that is a
narrativa
reality,
realidade,
a
né?
narrative which is
A partir
the
da
reality,
realidade, do
from the
conflito, e
reality,
muitas
from the
das vezes
conflict.
isso
And
o
many
próprio museu
times
não quer acolher.
the
E
museum
quando,
doesn't
às vezes,
want
quando a
to
gente fala, não, a
accept,
gente quer
to receive.
trazer
So when we
essa
say, well, we
cosmologia, um
want to
ponto de
bring this
vista mais,
cosmology, this
mais
viewpoint that is more
cosmológico, tem que ter
cosmological,
cuidado com isso
we
também,
must
que
be
pode até
careful with
ter
this as well, because there may be even a
reforço, né, de
some
estereotipado,
reinforcement
romantizado,
of
desromantização, e isso
stereotypes and
porque
other things.
não é
And
bem
this
assim, né?
because
Então,
it
por
is
isso
not
que é importante,
actually
o
like
museu
that.
também é o lugar
That's why
de
it is important
negociação,
to
o tempo
have
todo
a
tem que
museum
estar
as a
ali,
place
o
of
museu também
negotiation all the
é um
time. The
espaço
museum
de
is a
educar,
space
de
to
informar e
educate, to
também de
inform,
mediação,
and
porque eu
also of
acredito que o museu
mediation,
ela tem esse
because I
papel
believe
nesse
the museum
sentido,
has this
também
role
informar
in this
outras
sense of
instituições,
also
porque o museu é um
informing
lugar
other institutions,
muito
because the museum is
importante,
a
né?
place that is
Mas
very
também
important,
é muito
but it's also very
vulnerabilizado, digamos assim, se apenas
vulnerable
acolhe um ponto de vista.
belies,
Isso
turned
pode
vulnerable if it does not
virar uma
receive
coisa
or
mais
welcome other viewpoints. It could become
reforçar, né,
something that is, it would
os indígenas,
reinforce actually
apagamento dos indígenas real
the
de hoje, na
erasure,
atualização. Então, eu
of the indigenous
sempre
people
faço, né, a
today.
partir dessa minha
So I always
curadoria, sempre eu
do
tenho feito
from this
várias
curating
curadorias
practices. I have
e me
several curating
atravessa
projects, and
muitas
what
questões, né,
come to me
porque
are many questions,
eu tenho que negociar, inclusive,
and I
e
have to
trazer
negotiate
a
and
partir
actually
do
bring
conhecimento,
this
por exemplo, quando se
from the
trata de
knowledge, for
objeto,
example,
por exemplo,
when
muitas das vezes
we
hoje,
when it comes to
a
an
gente
object
produz
in
junto,
certain
pensa arte
regions, we
contemporânea
produce them
junto.
together to
Mas
think
aí,
about
o que é
contemporary
arte
art together.
contemporânea? A
What is
comunidade
contemporary
vai
art? The
produzir
community will
aquele momento para
produce
aquele lugar,
that
né,
time for
especificamente
that
de acordo com o
place
contexto
specifically according to the context they are experiencing. And that many times actually is not acknowledged, recognized as art. So, and then we have this issue of authorship, copyrights. How are you going to reward this knowledge that is being taken to the museum? Of course, not everything. Well, you are turned into an object. That not everything is an object, but actually strengthening the community in your own territory to continue with that knowledge. As for example, I've mentioned the knowledge of my Guarani people. It is a constant process that is never ending. As for example, a ritual. Our people, we have baptism, ritual of harvesting, stages of a person's life, of a group, of children, of the elderly. And all of this relationship, as I mentioned in the beginning, this whole ritual process depends on the river, it depends on the plants, on the animals, on the environment of nature where it exists to continue to be Guarani. What is it to be Guarani? You're being able to deal with those plants, with that river, with those animals that are around. As for example, when we take the bark or the shell of a plant to make tea, to make a remedy, we ask for permission. We hold a ritual to ask for permission to those plants. What if that plant is no longer there? How can we practice that? You see? So the practice is essential. So the day-to-day practice is not, we can actually conduct something that is imaginary of a work to take to the museum. But this day-to-day practice is impossible for you to take to a museum as an object. You must build there. You must build a policy. You must have actions to strengthen the community. And then there is another question. Okay. Oh, and what's in it for the museum? There is always this question. What does the museum gain with that? So I also have this difficulty. What is democracy? What is diversity? What is the role of the museum? What is the role of artists? I discussed today a lot artists and museums because they are three characters that are very important: the museum, the artist, the individual, but art that is collective, that is the object, that today has an instrument of debate as to how we can carry and transport this object to the museum and from the museum to the community. And how can we do that in the form of debate, of a project, as a way of strengthening the community? Strengthening the community doesn't mean that we necessarily need to take knowledge from one community to the museum, or the museum to move, and how to move and what the role is. I think this is the great challenge for us today when we talk about decolonizing. Sure. You touched a very important point, which is the museum or the cultural space as the space of negotiation. As Marilia brought up before when she spoke, it's not only what the museum needs, but what are the demands of the indigenous people? What are the demands of those social groups that are represented within the museum, but that actually have never had a space or a voice to be able to speak, to be self-represented, to be present there? So I think this point of the museum as a space of negotiation, as a space that will have to discuss things that are happening currently, and many times it doesn't have a direct connection to the collections that they have there in their archive, but that is part of what the museum represents, the role of the museum, of this space in which the museum still is an institution that is respected, that people look for to be able to learn more about certain things, where a researcher goes. All of these things are part of things that are in conflict, but they are part of the work of the museum.
I'm gonna switch back to English because I wanted to invite Georgia to come to this conversation. And I know, Georgia, that one of the projects that you have been working, you touch upon this in your first introduction. And you said very briefly about the cultural diplomacy. I said that I was curious about that, so I'm coming back into this. How do you think this concept can help cultural organizations to rethink their own practices and the collaborative work that we do? And I would be very happy to hear also like the kind of experience that you have through this project or even other projects that you wanted to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Sandra, Marilia, because as Sandra mentioned and formed the cultural diplomat actor negotiation, we curators and people who do public engagement programs, and we engage social groups, vulnerable groups, indigenous, not indigenous, international audience. We are the mediators. We start a different narrative. And Sandra mentioned it really and pointed out it like we don't have only this role to transfer a message. We need to share a global narrative. We need to speak for difficult also issues, not only the easy ones or the ones that object-oriented. We must focus, as we say, all museologists, and I come through its new definition about museum. We have to be participatory, inclusive, but democracy philosophy, policy has changed to all museum professionals. And this is how we engage and build trust with all audiences. It's really important. It's not a rhetorical, it's not a philosophical theory, but we do it in practice. 10 years ago, in 2014, we started with a collaborative project in my museum, Human Chain. We call it a human chain programs that we engage different audience. And we got outside our walls. We found through research with difficult, sometimes not so easy, but difficult collaborations outside our walls, especially for an archaeological museum. We went inside to educate people with say vulnerable groups, even in prisoners, in special, we call it in a different way, in vulnerable groups that reacted in a really powerful way. One of a time, actually it's a process. You don't do it just for a year. It's now almost 10 years that we are focusing on this human chain project. And 1 year ago, we had a group from a refugee team from UN that was engaged in our project. And one of the people, one of men said it felt like home. And he came from Egypt. He came from Africa, from a different culture, but in our collection, we have, because my city of Patras, was an international port through 2000 years ago. So he saw the mosaic floors. He saw the mosaic floors and with motifs and different elements that meant for him it was his culture. And he shared with us, it was really a powerful moment, that he wants to come every day and he felt like home. It was something incredible to hear. And so this is how you build trust. You tell different narratives, but you have to see the future. And the future is not AI, it's CI. It's something we measure. I also, from my research on academic project, we have to focus on cultural intelligence, no artificial. And this is what we have to point out. CI, not AI, for a global narrative, for building trust, peace, and these things that only human can share through museum collections.
That's great, Georgia. Thank you for bringing that. I love the CI,
Yes.
and I hope more people can adopt, instead of adopting
Yes.
AI everywhere, we should adopt more the CI as
This is what
as
our
a
world
concept.
needs, our nation's people. This is, I think, for me, it's really important, it's crucial, and it's a momentum for our here in this shared roundtable to point out and bring out to our participants and all researchers, professionals, educators, everyone with a holistic approach.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Nós temos algumas perguntas.
Great.
já
Well,
no chat
we actually do have
veio,
quite a
né,
few
dos
questions here
participantes
on the
hoje.
chat box from our participants.
Então,
And
a gente vai voltar.
so we are
Eu
going
acho que a
to get
questão,
back
né,
because I think
das novas tecnologias e desse mundo
that the new
digital
technologies and the
nós
digital
vivemos,
world
acho que
in
é
which we
um
are
ponto
all,
interessante e
you know,
importante para a
very
gente
much
discutir. Mas antes da gente entrar nessa discussão em si,
involved with,
eu
it's important
vou
for us to
propor uma
acknowledge.
pergunta
But
aqui
before
que é
we
da
get into
Gabriela
that
de
discussion,
Carvalho
let me
Freire,
ask one question from
que é
Gabriela de
do MAI,
Carvalho Freire.
da
She is from
UFPR.
the
E essa
MAI
pergunta para
from
você, Sandra,
UFPR. And this is actually to you,
a forma
Sandra.
você pode
The
falar
question is,
mais
could you
sobre a
tell us a little
relação
bit
entre
more
corpo,
about the
acervo e território?
relation between body, collection, and land or territory?
uma sensação difícil para eu poder
Yeah.
falar, mas aí eu
No,
posso
I'm not saying it's going to be that
fazer
easy, you know,
exemplos.
but I can try.
Né?
I can try to
Recentemente,
maybe give
eu
you an
ia até
example.
trazer
Just recently, and by way of that, I was about to,
mas como o
you
tempo
know,
curto,
bring some material to show to you, but I mean, our time was too short, so I decided not to, you know, put it in a presentation or anything. But let me report to you. Just recently, we had an exhibit here in Rio de Janeiro called Art and Resistance, Indigenous Resistance.
Enfim, aí o que a gente fez? Eu organizei todos esses artistas, chamei os artistas.
What I did was I called all the artists and we sort of orchestrated, you know, that movement. And the narrative, as Georgia said, which was an interesting thing, this is, and we've always touched the narrative. The body is part of the narrative. The cosmology is a body. So the cosmology is a body, narrative is a body, and based on your origin, your, you know, world vision is going to direct your perceptions on the communities. For instance, the quilombolas, or the Maroon communities, or indigenous communities, or they are going to have this self-construal, if you will, based on that, on those beliefs, on those set of beliefs. So that's why whenever we bring narrative and cosmology, and Georgia touched a lot on the narrative, it's a body. It's a body in itself, and in this question, when we connect body, territory, and art, an important thing comes into play, which is the art craft, and in our situation in particular. And we have a group of women, in Manaus, and which is the capital of the state of Amazonas, and they call it, they are carpets, they call it tupes, and they do our graphic patterns, and they do it with the straw, and it's a local fiber that they collect and prepare and dry in order to have it worn, and it's a mix of ethnic groups. So they have a specific knowledge on what is the moon stage that they have to harvest the raw material, that fiber, that leaf, which is obviously the raw material that is going to produce those tupés, those carpets. So, and there we can see that connection. You see that cosmology, and you base and it's based on that ancestral knowledge that those activities happen. So with that, we are able to see and regard that work of art as a body. So that's the very reason why we, from an indigenous communities, it's hard for us to say what is to preserve, the environment, or to do conservation action. So it's not a matter of removing people, to preserve a specific area or to preserve a species. You have to learn how to deal, how to manage, how to take good care of, and how to ask for the proper permission. So it's like our body, and that's why we are going to, deal and acknowledge that as a body, and pretty much as ours. And it's a body that you are a part of. You are one of the elements that comprise your very flesh, your breath, your elements. The matter is connected. So it's the matter and the story behind the matter, the narrative that has that ancestral knowledge that is going to obviously dictate many things, including health. So it's a whole set of elements that are sewn together. So it's about the ways of living, the ways of being, arts, aesthetics. So for instance, aesthetics, that's what aesthetics is to us. It's not a physical body of the individual, but the aesthetics involves knowing how to deal with our surroundings. What is the aesthetics of the Guarani tribe, for instance? And the Guarani people, since very early age, they learn how to harvest a specific species, how to ask for permission to hunt, how to ask for permission for the spirit of the water to allow them into a specific water body. So this is all interconnected. I'm not sure whether I've made myself understood, but this is how I see things, and this is based on the research I developed. That's basically what I could say as an answer to your question. Thank you very much, Sandra. No, I think you've just addressed beautifully that question from Gabriela. Now, the one, follow-up question that I think might be pertinent is that your explanation gives us a pretty good idea of that territorial body, the collection, and the heritage, and the way this materializes, the way this is expressed as a whole. So my question is in that sense of whether at any point in this relation between indigenous peoples, and in your case in particular the Guarani people that you mentioned, and the institutions and the museum, what were the conflicts that you observed, that you had to forego something, to give in a bit, to budge here and there? So if you could give us this more practical example of this relationship, and which is really a space of negotiation. Well, thank you. So, Isabel, when I did my first experience as a curator for the Museum of Art of Rio de Janeiro, the MAR, when I first talked to the community, what we did was the following. And by the way, it's not something that is personal. It's not me defining what has to be done. No, it's I have to first be able to listen and to interact with them, propose the project within the limits and the constraints, and then and to obviously talk in terms of very practical elements like the value, for instance, so that they understand that we are not only going there or just getting knowledge and bringing to the museum. And sometimes this is something that doesn't have a feedback, doesn't have a return, neither from the financial perspective nor from the social perspective.
This is very recurring, as I mentioned in the beginning. And so what happens? And they said, okay, I'm going to do it. So, well, since the community that we had asked, well, we had, reached to them to carry out the project, and they told us, yes, that they were going to make an item, an artifact to take to the museum. But then, some, not everyone, they started reproducing that same artifact that was in the museum. But this, I, as a curator, an indigenous person, I had to pay attention to be able to negotiate with my relatives. Well, I don't think this is what we should take. I think this, I cannot tell the community because they will not tell me, well, you can take it because it will represent a stereotype. I cannot tell them that. And then I had to go and explain to them in a different way so that they could actually understand what we actually need to bring to the museum. And when we started organizing things to bring other things, they started the community, the Pataxó community, they were occupying the Iriri in Angra dos Reis, which is a town near Rio de Janeiro, and Paraty. And we told them, well, we want to speak in the space of the museum, and we want to talk about our struggle for the territory, for the land, and we are going through discrimination, racism, we're going through violence acts in the space that we are occupying. And this is where the question is. It's not that we're going to receive or welcome and say, okay, not going to tell them that the museum will solve everything. It's not that. The museum had to seek another partnership that deals with, for example, with the issues territory, is talking about the FUNAI, which is the Brazilian Foundation of the Indigenous Peoples, talk about demarcation of land, and then the team team tried to make this connection with this community. It's not that we have resolved the issues. Of course, we talked about the importance of the territory, and they started bringing their struggle through videos, and they talked about the party, the importance of the land, the territory to them, having a river near a community. And we brought that in a video, as a video, to the museum. But the other part that they demanded from us, we had to actually set up a partnership with other people to be able to communicate with them. So those conflicts, and many times the museum says, well, I hear things, well, this is the work of an anthropologist, as if the museum did not have, as if, conflict is not art. What is it? There's a confusion or a misunderstanding. We must have a team. We curators must have a team that dialogues very much, that listens. We must have a team. It's very important that we should dialogue. I lost her. Sandra?
So
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting, but you were mute. So your last phrase. Oh, goodness me. Well, sorry. I just, muted my mic. Sorry. I know. I was just saying that the team is very important because we work for curators, and those teams, well, with these teams, we have several teams. We curators, researchers, and there are many other people that could seek those partners to make this connection. It's not that we have to take on this responsibility, but actually build the bridge things with other partners. So this conflict is recurrent. I have several other conflicts that I've had in the museum is to value, regarding the tupé. And how much is
so we're going to be much stricter
an artwork? There's this art of, this question of art and arts crafts, and the tupé disappeared. They were simply, they got lost on a plane. And we're going to seek this. We're going to go after the plane and the company.
The safety, and every time we classify.
So they're going to say we're going to actually charge as a workplace. And all these details are very important. The value, if it's been misled or if it got lost. And I'm going to say, no, it's not an object of a mobile that I have to change for another one. And I said, no, it is the amount, there's history, narrative, it has its territory, it has its wisdom, its science. I'm not going to lose it. Curating or curatorship is something that is filled with conflicts. As an Indigenous person, this is very complex. This is the struggle I carry wherever I go. It is tiring, exhausting, but this is what we have been doing as curators, sure. And there are several things, and, sure, it's an example.
Obrigada, Sandra. Eu não sei se houve pequeno probleminha aqui.
I don't know if there's been a slight problem with the translation. Were you able to hear? There was a dual sound entry, I think. I think one of the main points now that you raised, Sandra, it's the figure of the mediator that will translate the conversations from one side to the other. Of the various parts, and how important it is to have the various partnerships that will take place on all sides that help and that contribute for the work to be carried out. Our time is almost up. I could be here ever talking with you. Georgia, I'm going to turn over to you. Let me just share a message before I turn over to you, because just to be able to remind everyone taking part that we have a small survey at the end when you leave the call. Well, we have a brief survey that we'd like to kindly ask all of you to fill it out so that we can improve our activities. Georgia, is there anything that you would like to add?
Yes, Isabel, thank you. Because we talked about research and participatory methodology and approaches, I would like to interact a little bit with our participants and have a small comment that and a good museum practice from my museum that comes from relies on this that we talk the discrimination, the religious one. And I would like to say that now, and we change the timeline. So we have 2026, 25, sorry, went to the future, 2025, AD or CE. I don't know the academic ones, maybe they know the term, the new term. We don't use AD, Annus Domini, we use CE, Common Era, our common ground apart from religious and territories and everything. We have adjust this to our timeline, our museums, the academic communities also, instead of AD, because we are now in a big geopolitical conflict with religious, with different, and I think it's totally relative to the one mentioned, and to close this holistic approach of our common ground, our global citizen, the respect of the others, and how in practice we share and abandon those things. See, common era. Some museums don't, some countries depends, but has started now to be used instead of AD. I would like to finish and wrap up with this.
Thank you, Georgia.
I have put on the chat my email address. Anyone's because some of the audience and the participants wanted to share.
Yeah, thank you, Georgia. Let me switch back to Portuguese. A gente tem outras perguntas que vieram,
we have other questions that have
do tempo que a gente tinha
been sent to the chat, but we have 5 minutes to go on our conversation. And what am I going to do? I'm going to ask a general question that is not directed to any of you, but actually to all of you, Marília, Georgia, and Sandra. And I'd like you to comment very briefly that I would like to do. And just to say that Julia, Claudia, and Josephine, the question that have been asked on the chat that have not been answered here, I'm going to forward those questions to all the speakers so that they can be answered. And I believe that everyone from Europeana can afterwards, along with the video, can actually send the answers to those questions that have not been addressed today. My final question that I'd like you to reflect upon is on this process. This is a conversation that is an initial conversation that all of us expect to have future unfoldings and developments. So I'd like you to briefly make some final remarks as to how do you see the future of this process we're just starting now that is so long ahead, and how do you see the future of this relationship between museums, cultural institutions, or cultural heritage institutions with the world, not specifically speaking of indigenous peoples or other groups or local communities. How can this transformation take place? How can we contribute for this to happen, and how this contribution between Brazil and Europe, how can it help in this process? Mic is open. I don't know who would like to speak first, just to keep a brief answer, please. Thank you. Marília, you may start. Well, my final words with this question that is so important, I'd like to answer in the following way from my work. What I have learned with my indigenous partners is that the museum is the extension of their territories and not the opposite. To me, this is very important. This larger social space of which the museum is part. It is an example. We can expand that, but we understand it. We understand what the museum is. I'm not talking about definition. I'm talking about practice, materially. What is the museum, and how can actually the museum do in its specificity, not mixing up with other sectors or institutions? What is the actual place of the museum? Still answering the question, I'd like to say that the place of the museum may be delimited, but it is a space that is flexible above all, because ties or do not favor us. We cannot have those locks making the museum that is inner-centered and enclosed in itself. So I'd like to say it is a place where a lot of ideas live together, many things. Sandra put it very well as to how this happens, to have the indigenous participation. I'd like to remind all of you here with us is that the museum is a place of conflict, of disputes, of disagreements. And somebody can say, oh, this is horrible. No, this is our work. So those that work with democracy and dialogue have to learn how to deal with conflicts that are part of my institution as well. It's not that the indigenous bring the conflict is within mine and other institutions. So we have disputes and conflicts in between different fields of knowledge, disagreements, all of this because we are a plural society, diversity exists, the differences exist, and this is a space for voices and different visions. This is why our museums are contradictory as a characteristic. I don't want to change that. I just want to understand contradictions. I'm interested in understanding contradictions. But actually, despite of all of that, we have negotiations and agreements. And actually, in the negotiations and agreements is where our future lies, answering your question. And there is a very specific place in the specificity of museums, which is called collection management policy. So our task in the future is to make this respect and this trust to have a concrete expression regarding what we are, what we do, and especially how we do it within this immense political game in which the museum is inserted. It is the present, future of negotiations and agreements, and this should be expressed in the policy of collection management. Thank you. Greetings.
So I'd like to invite Sandra, if you would like to say your final remarks, Sandra, please, so that we can wrap up our conversation. Well, yes, indeed. I think that the museum is a place where we are able to amalgamate the understanding and the, the listening and the understanding of what is to preserve nature, for instance. So, because people have different ways of, doing the same thing, of preserving it, but we have, at the end of the day, it's the very same element. So that is something that should be, that consideration and that understanding should be there in order for people to gather and talk about, which is also related to the territory, to the land, to the flora, for instance, and also to preserve the world, the land itself. And of course, conflicts are quite natural because, we are dealing with diversity. We are humans, and humankind is, per nature, very diverse. So the trap that we have to be mindful of is to have the museum trying to focus on the specificities of each one of them. This is something that the cultures themselves have to preserve, but the museum has to, consolidate itself as a common point, as a commonality, as a common area that welcomes everybody, that is democratic, that will welcome, because we are diverse, we are plural, as Marilia said that so well. So the museum would never be able to focus on the differences, on the specificities, but rather on the commonalities, and also try to think from the aesthetics, concepts, because sometimes we fail to admire others because we think that they are not beautiful, or that they are not this or that. But in reality, it's not an adaptation. We have to just, basically try to be and be sensitive to, the wind and that sway of, and sometimes we will not fit, and it's okay if we don't fit, but it's not something that we have to, force and try to impose. And this is something that we have to be really mindful of. We know that there are conflicts are there, and we have to be able to preserve the dialogue, be able to listen to others, and to admire how the different cultures and peoples prepare their food and deal with one another. And so we have to be able to admire one another. And we consume too much food and apparel and so on, and we have to be able to admire those differences. And it's really fundamental for us to be more harmonious in our coexistence here, and even with the ones which are not alike us. Yeah, thank you very much, Sandra. Georgia?
Some final remarks?
Yes, just short. Speaking and coming from Greece, from Athens, where democracy started, founded, and policy from the word polis, which is a group of human that hold the power. This is the soft power of culture, of museum, to transfer the world, to build the trust, and through, as Sandra and Marilia said, through knowledge, through collaboration, through just listening the others and trying to get all these key characteristics, to embed them, to put it in your collections, in your programs, in your curatorial projects, international or national. And transparency, and then set the policy framework. It's really important, and for collections, and for programs, and for the engagement, and build trust with all audience as the citizen of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgia. eu realmente nem sei o que falar,
Thank you,
assim, nesse
Georgia.
final aqui.
Yeah, well,
A
you
gente
see,
já
I'm a bit,
ultrapassou um pouquinho o tempo que a gente tinha
yeah,
previsto. Tem duas
speechless, but
palavrinhas para eu poder
we've
dizer
actually
que,
a
para mim,
bit,
realmente foi grande
beyond
prazer
our
estar aqui
time. But
liderando
I
essa
think we
conversa.
can't
Eu
finish
espero
without
que a
saying that
gente
it was a
possa ter
huge pleasure,
outros momentos
for
nos
me to
quais a
be
gente
here with
possa
you, and I
sentar,
really am looking
dialogar,
forward to
abrir para outras
other moments
perguntas.
like this when we can sit
E eu queria
down
só
and
destacar, né, duas
engage
coisas
in
que
this
eu queria,
dialogue.
que
And
eu
let me
queria
just
dizer em
highlight
todas
two
essas falas
things that we
finais,
saw,
que
and
são do
in that
respeito e
was a
do diálogo,
commonality, which
né,
was
do quanto
respect
isso é
and
importante
dialogue, and how much
para
those two elements
construir o
are of
nosso
the
trabalho
essence,
no
are
mundo aí,
absolutely
em direção
essential
ao futuro, que
to
a gente espera que seja muito
keep
melhor do que a
that
gente tem
work
agora.
towards the future,
Cláudia,
and
eu
that we
te
hope
chamo
it's
aqui de
better than the one
volta
we have now. So,
ao palco
Claudia,
para poder
let me
fechar aqui
give the floor
essa
to
conversa
you so
maravilhosa
that
que a gente
you
teve hoje.
can
Muito obrigada a
close
todos
this
vocês.
wonderful conversation session that we had the chance to run today. Thank you very much once again to all of you. I just meant to reinforce our gratitude. Thank you very much to all of you. We've had something like 100 people global, watching us. Thank you to the speakers. Let me just give you two quick reminders. As Isabel mentioned, we want to foster new actions in the following year here at Europeana, not only with Brazil, but with other Portuguese-speaking countries. So this is a very important step towards the future. And all the ones who are interested, they can be part of the Europeana network that currently gathers more than 5,000 people. The link, it's on the form and on the chat box, so you can click on it and you can register and take a look at the form. And thank you very much once again.